When we began the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, he's bringing it back, thank you. Thank you. When we began the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, I said somewhat naively, we wanted to create a social movement. I wasn't entirely clear what a social movement was or how you created one, but it seemed to me rather important. And I would say, looking around this room, we are part of that social movement. We, colleagues, are on the winning team. It's not straightforward. Progress is not inevitably, ineluctably forward. There are barriers in the way. But with colleagues like you, and I said something similar when I was addressing the Swedish Association of Local Authorities and Regions. 20 Swedish regions represented, 340 enthusiastic people in the room. And similarly in Norway, my assistant back in London says, why are you going to those Nordic countries? They don't need you, they're doing it already. But if you want to work to create a fairer world, and you think I can help you in that way, then I'm only too pleased to be here. We published the report of the Commission on Social Determinants of Health, the WHO Commission, in 2010. We called that report Closing the Gap in a Generation. In that report, we referred to the more than 40-year difference in life expectancy across the world. Something terrible is going to happen here. Oh my God, that was a maneuver that I didn't plan for. Here we go. We pointed to a more than 40-year difference in life expectancy across the world. And we said, closing the gap in a generation. It was a statement that we had the knowledge to close the gap in a generation. It was a statement that we have the means to close the gap in a generation. The question is, do we have the will? And I illustrated it at the time. We put in our report of the WHO Commission that 1 billion people in the world live in slums. We said it would cost $100 billion to upgrade the world's slums. And when we said that, I thought, who's going to take us seriously? Who is going to find $100 billion for anything? Last time I looked, we had found $11 trillion to bail out the banks. For 1/110th of the money we found to bail out these reprehensible banks, every urban dweller could have clean running water. Do we have the knowledge? We have the knowledge. Do we have the means? We have the means. $11 trillion to bail out the banks. The question is, do we have the will? And I think that applies to health inequalities in all of our own countries. I was invited by the British government to answer the question, how could we apply the findings of the WHO Commission on Social Determinants of Health to one country, England? So I did this review, which we called Fair Society, Healthy Lives. It's quite interesting, I think, because I was commissioned by a Labour government. Soon after I reported, the government changed, as predictably it was going to do. We now have a Conservative-led coalition government. And some of you will know that this has a history. In 1978, the then Labour government commissioned Sir Douglas Black to do a report of health inequalities. By the time he reported, Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And she said, this is a whole load of rubbish. The sainted Margaret, who was buried with more hypocrisy and cant than you've ever seen, outpouring the Tory party hated her. They hated her. They couldn't wait to stab her in the back. And in case that didn't work, they stabbed her in the front. And then she died, and this outpouring, she was the most wonderful, fantastic, etc. Anyway, she buried the Black Report. 18 years we were not allowed to talk about health inequalities. It was off the agenda. And people said, Marmot will go the way of black. Commissioned by the Labour government, reporting into a Conservative government, and they'll bury it. They didn't. They issued a public health white paper. They said reduction of health inequalities has to be at the centre of our public health strategy, and we need action on the wider determinants of health. We embrace Michael Marmot's report. As I'll say a little bit later, nearly all of it. But I'm slightly regretful at the title that I gave the report, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. It was a claim that if you put fairness at the heart of all policy making, health would improve and health inequalities would diminish. I'm regretful because the government uses the word fairness as if it has no meaning at all. They cut the top rate of tax and they say it's fair. They cut tax credits to poor people and they say it's fair. They cut funding to the poorer local governments and they say it's fair. As if fairness was a word you applied to government policy retrospectively, whatever you do. And I debated with our health minister, our Secretary of State for Health, and I said, I use fairness in a technical sense. Systematic inequalities between social groups that are judged to be avoidable by reasonable means and are not avoided are unfair. Therefore, any policies that retard progress toward reduction of these avoidable health inequalities are unfair. And that's how we judge it. And it's difficult because I produced this report commissioned by a Labour government, now a Conservative government. If you're too overtly critical, they just brush you under the carpet. If you censor yourself, this is George Orwell, the party's won. Self-censorship in a way is the worst form of censorship, because you can't blame anybody but yourself. And my line through this is that we have to tell the truth. And just to illustrate, I was in Rome 2 weeks ago on a Friday, about this time, and I went to the BBC studio near the Vatican to do a live interview on our morning news programme on the BBC. And I was on with the health minister, the public health minister. And I said pretty much what I've just been saying, that there were two features of the current scene. One good and one not so good. The good one was the government had taken upon itself a statutory duty for reduction of health inequalities. Great. The not so good was that their economic policies were going in the other direction and they were likely to make health inequalities worse. A civil servant sent me, he said, you might like to see this, what the public health minister said at a debate in the House of Commons. And she said, I was on BBC Today programme last week, and so I know for a fact that Michael Marmot, who produced this brilliant report on health inequalities, is completely supportive of government policy. I looked at the transcript. It was unequivocal. I said government economic policy will make health inequalities worse. But because I praised the commitment for reduction of health inequalities, I'm completely supportive of government policy. My wife said, some of your friends on the other side, I don't like that very much. But it seems to me the only way forward is to tell the truth. And sometimes that truth will be uncomfortable. But we have to tell the truth. If we think they're doing something good, we should say that. And if we think things are going in the wrong direction, we should say that too. Because if we don't, who will? And we're about to publish the European Review of Social Determinants of Health and the Health Divide. We used the same model, I won't go through this, the same conceptual model in the European Review that we used in the WHO Commission, but I won't take your time this morning. This summarizes our approach in the European Review. We have 4 areas, 4 domains of recommendations. Life course stages, the wider society, the macro level context, and health systems. And on the life course stages, prenatal, early years, working age, and older age. And I'll illustrate some of that. We said very clearly, and the regional director, Susanna Jakob, was having a meeting of her advisory council on health research, and I was going to see her yesterday afternoon, and then I get an email, could you come a bit earlier and talk to my advisory council about the European Review? And I made clear that this is a question of having the research evidence, but a bit like Fair Society, Healthy Lives, I make the case that we have a moral responsibility. And I illustrated it. I've been an advocate for intervention in early childhood based on the evidence. And people are saying there's a good economic case. And I said, I hate it. Why do you hate it? Because there's no good economic case for supporting older people. Throw them on the scrap heap. They're useless. Now, I have a vested interest in older people not being thrown on the scrap heap. This is something I can relate to. But there's no economic case for keeping older people going. So if you make the economic case for investment in early childhood, what are you going to do for older people? They're part of society. We do that for moral reasons. You don't throw older people on the scrap heap because there's no economic case for allowing them to flourish. It's too short-sighted. And I don't even want anyone to make the economic case. If you said, well, 70-year-olds, care for grandchildren or something, and you put a dollar value on caring for the grandchildren, forget it. That's not why we should be good to older people, because they're part of our society, and we should make the arrangements to allow them to flourish. So, we said very clearly in the European Review, you're getting an advanced taste of our publication. We made the case for social justice, and we said more explicitly for the first time the importance of intergenerational equity, which is a concept we borrowed from sustainable development. It goes all the way back to Grohar and Brundtland and sustainable development. We shouldn't compromise the needs of future generations by action in this generation, where we know what affects adults today has a profound effect on their children. So we're concerned not just with equity within the generation, but intergenerational equity, and of course gender equity. For the first time, we've been more explicit about human rights. We take a life course approach. We consider vulnerability as well as exposures. And in approaching excluded groups, we think about exclusion as a process rather than a property of an excluded group. So if you think about illegal immigrants or informal migrants, about Roma, there's a woman in Britain who, what's the word? She's been tracking me, whatever you call it. Every time I talk, this woman would be in the room and she'd lift up a hand and say, I represent gypsies and travellers. I don't see myself in your report. Everywhere I go, and there she was. I represent gypsies and travellers. Where am I in your report? And for Finally, we've reached an accommodation now. She's got me to say, look, we didn't do enough about gypsies and travellers because I talk about the gradient, the graded relation between social level and health. And she said, we're off your scale. Well, our way of dealing with this is to talk about proportionate universalism. What we think we've learned from the Nordic countries is the importance of universalist policies. But investment has to be proportionate to need. And if excluded groups need more investment, then so it should be. And we said empowerment is key. Health inequalities follow social inequities and the social gradient, which I just mentioned. Evidence is key. This comes from Johan Mackenbach's work looking at the slope index of inequality across European countries in male death rate. So the slope index of inequality is a way of looking at absolute differences graded according to level of education. And then the summary, in a way, is telling you what the difference is between the top level and the bottom level of education. And what you can see, if that's the European average, that all the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, the former communist countries, had bigger inequalities in male mortality than the European average. And the older European countries have smaller inequalities. And I'll say a bit more a bit later about, is there a Swedish paradox? Is it the case that despite a highly developed welfare state, Sweden fails to have narrow health inequalities? Interestingly, when Johan Mackenbach first published this, Sweden appeared to have bigger inequalities than England and Wales. And I said, that's not the data I've seen. And I wrote to Swedish colleagues and said, are you sure about this? And it turned out that there was no mistake in the Swedish data, there was a mistake in the British data. That just made it look like we had narrower health inequalities in Sweden. We don't. Denmark and England and Wales are about the same. The level of our health inequalities are kind of in the middle of the non-former communist country range. And even in Sweden, this is mortality from 91, 95, 2006, 2010. For women, there was a 3.2-year gap in life expectancy, and over the next 15 years, life expectancy improved for all groups, but improved more rapidly for women with higher education. So there was a 4.1-year gap, went from 3.2 to 4.1. And for men, the gap went from 5 to 6 years. A very well-known economist at an international meeting, at which I was not present, said, Michael Marmot would like rich people to die earlier in order to reduce health inequalities. Were I American, I would have sued him. I thought that was a calumny. And I wrote to him and said, it's totally untrue. He said, you did say that. I pointed him to chapter 10 of my book, Status Syndrome, which was published in 2004, which he read, where I said, that's not the case. We want health to improve for everybody. Now, as this man said, because I discussed it with him in his living room, he said all economists would say that this situation is fairer than that one, because health has improved for everybody. I said, you're telling me that bigger health inequalities are fairer than shallower ones? Well, he said, they're certainly better. Everyone's better off. I'm going to take my ball and go home and play with somebody else. I said, well, then surely we must have two social goals. One is to improve health for everybody. Great. That's what's been happening in Sweden and in the United Kingdom and in many other countries. The second social goal is to narrow the gap, to make the social gradient shallower. So we're doing well on the first and not well on the second. We shouldn't say, great, things are getting better and go home. We should say, great, things are getting better, but the gap's increasing. We have much more work to do. And in Russia, this is the probability of a man of 20 surviving to 65. For those with less than secondary education, the probability has gone down dramatically. For those with university education, has gone up. So the gap between them has increased. Let me illustrate the gradient. This was figure 1 from the English Review. Each of these dots represents a small area of the country. We have here the most affluent and the most deprived. The top graph is life expectancy. And what you can see is those near the top have shorter life expectancy than those at the top. Those in the middle, shorter than those near the top. It's a gradient all the way from top to bottom. The gap between the 5th centile and the 95th centile is 7 years. But that's not the real message of this graph. The real message is it's a gradient. For disability-free life expectancy, the gradient is steeper. The gap between the 5th and the 95th centile is now not 7 years, but 17 years. And that means that people at the top live about 12 years on average with disability, and people at the bottom live about 20 years on average with disability. This horizontal line represents pension age, retirement age. It was 65. The previous government wanted to increase it to 68 by 2046. The present government wants to do that more rapidly. And having said that, I don't think the reason for doing what we're doing is an economic one. We need to make the moral argument. Just in case that doesn't work, I have pointed out to people in government the economic argument. If you want people to work to 68, you've got to recognize the social gradient. 3/4 of the population do not have disability-free life expectancy as long as 68. If raising the pension age to 68 meant that people went on to disability benefits instead of pension, you'd save no money, and it would be a dubious social advance. You have to deal with the whole social gradient, not just the people at the very bottom. What are we going to do about it? As you said in your introduction, I've spent my life doing research, but now I'm trying to package that research in a way that might lead to action. So let's start with the early years. Evidence for Britain shows a social gradient in the proportion of children who are read to every day at age 3. The higher the socioeconomic level of the parents, the greater likelihood that children will be read to every day at age 3. It was put to me that when I did my report, we would be reporting into an adverse economic climate. Here's a really expensive intervention. Read to your children. And if parents are ground down by poverty and misery and depression, if they're scarcely literate themselves, the evidence shows that services can make a difference. Good child services can make a difference. And I was presenting these data to a meeting in one region of England, and there were 26 chief executives of local government and 26 chief executives of primary care trusts. And one chief executive of local government, when she saw this, she leapt to her feet and said, "We should implement this afternoon. What are we waiting for?" Indeed, what are we waiting for? We can make a difference. Regular bedtime at age 3, and mother suffered postnatal depression. The gradient, of course, goes the other way, with catastrophic effects on social and emotional development of children. So we said a great deal about parenting and family support, preschool education and care, primary, secondary and tertiary education and training. Somebody asked me at WHO yesterday, "Oh, isn't it all led in the environment?" Forget parenting, it's all led in the environment. It's a bit like the discussion, isn't it all smoking? Forget social. And I said, of course, led in the environment is important. It is one of the mechanisms by which lower social position is related to cognitive and intellectual development of children. But that doesn't let parenting or other services off the hook. The psychological and social input to children is, of course, key. Report card 9 from the UNICEF Research Centre, ranking 24 OECD countries on equality and child well-being, shows Denmark, Finland, Netherlands, Switzerland, right up here as having the most equitable circumstances for raising children. Oh my God, the UK is down here. But I was in the US last week and I said, I'm really grateful to America. It's the only big country that makes us seem not quite so bad. At a WHO meeting, the Minister of Health of one country, which I don't think I should name, but it was the Netherlands, said, I don't think WHO should be doing any of this social determinant stuff. Health is a matter of personal responsibility. We should forget all this social business. People should look after themselves. And I looked at her and said, what about the children? What about the children? Don't blame the children for having a poor environment. It's not their fault that they were born into poverty. Look at the Netherlands, I said. You're right up there. You want to pull the ladder up after you. You don't think anybody else should have the same equitable social conditions that lead to better child development. This is not the children's fault. And once you think about the children, this whole issue about personal responsibility, so what you think about intergenerational equity, if you're going to blame parents for somehow being irresponsible, you're condemning the children because of their parents' feckless behavior. How can you do that in a civilized society? Quite apart from my criticism of blaming parents, but it just doesn't fit with the evidence. And the latest report card 13 from UNICEF, we've done fantastically well in Britain. We've gone from 20 out of 21 to 16 out of 21. But the good old United States of America, I love shaming my American colleagues. You've got the richest country. You spend the most on healthcare, and you're doing appallingly badly. You should be ashamed of yourselves. And they are ashamed. It is shameful that they debate tax cuts for the rich in Congress and they refuse to spend money on early childhood. It's shameful. And we, as scientists, with the evidence, need to make that case. And spending on early childhood makes a difference. PISA scores is nothing to do with a leaning tower. It's the program of international student assessment at age 15 and 16 on, I think, maths, literacy and science. So this is looking at the difference in PISA scores by whether children attended preschool for more than 1 year. So in all these countries, if children attended preschool for more than 1 year, their scores at age 15 and 16 on this program of international student assessment was much higher. And that's even after accounting for socioeconomic background. And in these countries, much of it was socioeconomic, but not all of it. Well, think about health inequalities. It means early child development, preschool can help, education, PISA scores, not being unemployed as a young person, having a decent job, more money, living in a better neighbourhood, and all of that, and older people get thrown off the edge. And all of that, of course, relates to better health and potentially narrower health inequalities. So that's why we take a life course approach. I don't know how to say this casually, as if I always do this. I was at a meeting at number 10 Downing Street just the other day. In fact, I've been twice to Downing Street. The first time I was still cycling, and I arrived with my bicycle, and I said to the policeman, "What can I do with my bicycle?" They said, "Bring it in." And I said, "Do I need to lock it up?" And they said, "There's 6 policemen here." And then I said to them, "You know what? If my bike got nicked from number 10 Downing Street, I would dine out on that for the rest of my life. So I'm quite happy not to lock it up." But the reason I was there was because there's a new early intervention foundation on intervention in early childhood. And the Prime Minister had agreed to host the launch of this because it's cross-party. A Labour MP had the initiative. I'm a trustee of it, and the Prime Minister was launching it. And he made a very moving speech. He's a very articulate speaker, a very moving speech about the importance of early childhood. And I'm standing there thinking, his policies are making child poverty worse. Child poverty is a key driver of early child development. His policies are making child poverty worse. Well, it was not the opportunity to say that, it was not the occasion. But I write about it, and I do say it. But you can do something about child poverty. This is child poverty measured as less than 60%. Before 60% of median income, before and after social transfers. So if we look, say, at Latvia, child poverty before social transfers was about 35%, and in Sweden it was about 32%. After social transfers, in Latvia it went from 35 to 25%, and in Sweden it went from 32% to about 12%. The US looks more like Latvia than it does like Sweden. And I said to my American colleagues, you clearly like having high levels of child poverty, or you're at least tolerant of it, otherwise you would do something about it. It's entirely possible. You've chosen in Denmark to be intolerant of child poverty. It's not something you want to live with. So you've chosen to have low levels of child poverty. We seem to be moderately tolerant. So we're not as bad as the US, which looks like Latvia, but we're not as good as Sweden and Denmark, which are quite intolerant of child poverty. But it means that you can make a difference. A group called 4 Children in the UK that provide early intervention for children came to see me. And I said, do you do any good? What do you mean, do we do any good? We provide services for children and parents. I said, does it make any difference? Well, we wouldn't do it if it didn't make any difference. I said, how do you know? Well, we do it. It must be good. Is it possible you're wasting your time? I asked. Well, I suppose. Have you ever looked? Do you know? Have you ever evaluated what you do? I mean, you sound like wonderful people, and I'm delighted you're doing what you're doing, but wouldn't it be useful to know if you're making a difference? So they asked us to help them answer the question. So we produced a report for them, our UCL Institute of Health Equity, on improving outcomes in children's centres. And we divided the outcomes into three: child development, cognitive, communication and language, social and emotional, and physical development. Parenting, a safe and healthy environment, active learning, and positive parenting, and the circumstances in which parents live their lives, mental well-being, knowledge and skills, and being financially self-supporting. We said, here are some potential ways you could evaluate what you're doing. We're now going to pilot it for you. After we published the English review, we said that monitoring is absolutely vital. And we monitored three social determinants: the proportion of children aged 5 who had good child development, the proportion of young people not in employment, education or training, NEET, and the proportion of adults in poverty, means tested benefits. And these were the figures on the proportion of children aged 5 who were thought to have a good level of development. And you can see it relates very closely to level of deprivation of the local area. The more affluent the local area, the better the score. The more deprived, the worse the score. The first thing to say is the median was at 56%. That means only 56% of children were rated as having a good level of child development at age 5 in the country. And I thought to myself, how could that possibly be the case? Only 56% of children have a good level of development, just over half, or nearly half, don't. How is that possible? Well, I showed you the OECD scorecards. In Britain, we were bumping along near the bottom of the rich countries. It's quite possible that we are failing our children on a grand scale, and that we like to congratulate ourselves. We've got a developed country, and good levels of education and so on, but we're not doing very well. And what the scatter around the line tells us is that there are two messages we can take from this graph. The first is, the narrower the social and economic inequalities in society, the narrower the inequalities in early child development are likely to be. So if we could move these people up there, there would be a smaller gap. Notice I didn't say if we could move these down there. We want to move everyone up. But the second is, for a good level of for a given level of deprivation, there's a lot of scatter around the line. That means you can break the link between deprivation and poor early child development. I went to Birmingham, where they're actively implementing my review, the 6 domains that I recommended in the English review. And what they did in Birmingham was they focused on young people, and children and young people, and they took off the shelf some established interventions: family nurse partnerships, Incredible Years Parenting Program, paths, and Triple P. These are all have evidence showing they make a difference. This is the percent of children who have a good level of early child development in Birmingham at age 5. It's worse in Birmingham than the English average, which it would fit because Birmingham is more deprived than the English average. In 3 years, they closed the gap. In 3 years, they closed the gap. They didn't get rid of deprivation in Birmingham. They broke the link between deprivation and poor child outcomes. Wow! That's fantastic! I've got people all around England beating a path to Birmingham's door saying, what did you do? We want to do it too. We can make a difference really quickly. That's very encouraging. I've been going around the world saying I'm an evidence-based optimist. This is the evidence for my optimism. The evidence shows we can make a difference really quickly. I said that the government took up, in the English review we made 6 recommendations, and the government took up 5 of the 6. Early child development, education, employment and working conditions, sustainable healthy places to live, and prevention. What they didn't do was number 4, which was minimum income for healthy living, which we said was vital. And that's part of working age policy. We said in the Commission on Social Determinants of Health that employment and working conditions are important because of financial security, paid holidays, social protection benefits, social status, personal development, social relations, a whole set of reasons why work is important. If we look at psychosocial working conditions, effort-reward imbalance and low control by occupational class, very low occupational class, much more likely to have imbalance between effort and rewarded work, and much more likely to have low control in the workplace. And it's a graded relation, particularly for low control. The lower the status, the more likely they are to have low control. So quality of work matters. So does having a job. Unemployment rates by education. The lower the education down here, the higher the unemployment. And I won't go into this, but each of these represents different immigrant groups. And the more marginal people are, the more likely they are to be unemployed. Why do we care about unemployment? It's actually bad for health. It's bad for health. Looking across Europe, a 1% rise in unemployment is associated with a 0.8% rise in suicide and a 0.8% rise in homicide. And people are, when the unemployment rate goes up, people kill themselves and they kill each other. It's not good. But if you're a policymaker, you don't have to worry about it because traffic deaths go down. People can't afford to take the car out, so that's good news. No effect on all-cause mortality, so we don't have to worry. If you look at unemployment in the old and new European Union member states and suicide, when unemployment ticked up, suicide ticked up. But policies make a difference. A 3% rise in unemployment would be associated with a 3% rise in suicide were there no spending on social protection. In East European countries, they spend about $37 a head on social protection. That's active labour market programs, family support, healthcare and unemployment benefits. And a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with about a 2.5% rise in suicide. And in Western European countries, where we spend about $150 a head, a 3% rise in unemployment is associated with less than 1% rise in suicide. So government policy can mitigate the ill effects of the rise in unemployment. In our English longitudinal study of aging, thinking about older ages, we showed that people in professional and managerial classes reach the same level of disability as those in the lower orders about 15 years later. And the same for cognitive function. If you want to have a level of cognitive function consistent with an independent life, you're better off to be high status than young. Because old people have the same level of cognitive function 15 years later if they're high status than if they're low status. Enormous differences. And we think circumstances matter. This is again from the English longitudinal study of aging, spending on basics as a percent of income. In the poorest quintile, people spend 48% of their income on basics, and in the richest quintile, they spend 16%. And spending as a percent of income between 2004-05 and 2008-09 went up quite sharply in the poorest quintile, and it's likely to have gone up even more. And in Britain, we've preserved the level of pension. So despite that, it's not going up as fast as inflation. Now that means when we calculated minimum income for healthy living, we said it's the minimum necessary not just to have food and shelter, but to lead a life of dignity and take your place in society. Well, if the proportion of your income spent on food and shelter is going up, we know people are choosing either to eat or be warm, or eat warm and not buy presents for their grandchildren. These are the sort of choices at the bottom of the scale. And it's not because we haven't got enough money in the society. It's because of how we're choosing to distribute it. I'm conscious of the warning, so macro level context. I've already referred to this when I talked about my non-exchange with the Minister of Public Health on BBC Radio. We were commissioned to do a report by the London Health Inequality Network, several London local authorities, to ask what's the likely effect of the economic downturn and the policy changes that have happened because of the economic downturn on health inequalities in London. And we said that we needed to look at income, employment, and housing. This is similar to what I just showed you about suicide rates going up. We said that if income goes down, if housing becomes more difficult, and there are fewer jobs, health will suffer. And those effects will be greater the lower down in the hierarchy. We also talk about sustainable development, but I'm conscious of the time. Why does society? And this comes to the question that I mentioned in the beginning. Is there a Swedish paradox? We had a meeting, I think you were at, in Stockholm at the end of January, which was all about the question of, is there a Swedish paradox? Many of us look at the Nordic countries and say, you've got a set of policies that look like the right sort of policies to protect the population and narrow health inequalities. One distinguished European scientist said in Sweden, they're doing everything that Michael Marmot recommended and their health inequalities are growing, therefore Marmot's wrong. Well, interesting question. Espendal questioned whether in fact that's the case. What he did was look not just at mortality, but at self-reported health, primary education, secondary education, and tertiary education by country, and looked at net total social expenditure in purchasing power parities. And what he showed is the greater the social expenditure of a country, the narrower the health inequalities. That suggests that social expenditure is a good thing, which is consistent with the Nordic welfare model. And that's men and that's women. And looking at welfare generosity and non-employment for those with limiting long-standing illness, is having a long-standing illness a barrier to getting into work? Yeah, it is, if you've got primary education and you're in a country with rather miserly welfare expenditure. Those with limiting long-standing illness and only primary education are very unlikely to be in work. But the greater the welfare generosity, the narrower the gap between educational groups in the likelihood of being in work, and similarly in those without limiting long-standing illness. And healthcare systems are important, of course. I won't go into that. Malmö, the city of Malmö in southern Sweden, not very far from here. Oh, this is totally irrelevant to my talk, but I can't resist telling you this. I was going to Chicago and I'd been invited to dinner by the editor of JAMA, and he's addicted to his BlackBerry, and I get a message saying, "Where are you?" I said, "I'm at O'Hare Airport in the immigration hall." And an hour later he says, "Where are you now?" I said, "I'm at O'Hare Airport in the immigration hall." And then an hour later he says, "Where are you now?" "I'm in a traffic jam on the way from O'Hare Airport to the hotel." And an hour later, I think, "Gosh, you do things well in Chicago," I said to him. And then I was going from there to Malmö. So I couldn't resist sending him an email. And I said, "I arrived in Copenhagen. 40 minutes later, I checked into my hotel. Remind me again what it is you Americans think Europeans are doing wrong." But I went to Malmö because of the Malmö Commission. They said, how can we apply the recommendations of the WHO Commission to one city in Sweden? They said to me, "What should we do now that we've reported?" I went for the launch in March 2013. "What should we do?" I said, "Get on the road, go and tell people about it. Tell everyone what you've done and let everyone see." And there's 6 areas for action, look very much like what we've been saying: children and young people, living, environment and urban planning, education, income and employment, health services, and changes in processes for socially sustainable development. Great. Let me finish with London. Do you recognize this man? You saw him on your television screens during the Olympics. If I had any hair, and the photographer was coming, I'd probably do this. Boris Johnson clearly does this before the photographers come. It's part of the blonde bombshell. Why am I showing you this? He is the second most important elected Conservative politician in Britain. He's the Mayor of London, and he's a Conservative. And I went to see him because I thought if I could get the Conservative Mayor of London to take my messages on board, then I can say this is not just for social democratic governments. We can do this across the political spectrum. So I went to see Boris, and after coffee, if you ask me, I'll tell you more details about the meeting. It was a bit hilarious. And they produced a health and equality strategy for London. And I read this strategy and I thought, this is terrific. This is really terrific. I could have written this. And I read it again and I thought, I did write this. This is great. So of course I liked it because they took it from our reports. And these are their 5 strategies. Empowering individuals and communities, great, that's what we said, the WHO Commission. Equitable access to high quality health and social care services, great. Now, you've had croissant and coffee, you're feeling strong, resilient. This is a Conservative Mayor of London in Britain, Conservative country. You ready for objective number 3? You're sure you're strong, you can take this. You're sitting comfortably. Wow! This is the City of London where the bankers' bonuses can be seen from outer space, they're so large. Deal with income inequality in health. Wow! Health, work and well-being and healthy places. That's pretty good. Let me end by saying, when we were doing the English Review, I got Boris Johnson to sign up, but we worked with the City of Liverpool, which is one of the more deprived cities in the country.